Terence Bud Crawford, Errol Spence Jr. We take another look at the resume conversation. Now, I'm going to take a different approach on this one. This is your boy JG. This is the Punch Report. Let's get right into the content. Listen, a little bit of housekeeping. Your boy's under the weather, so that's why my voice sounds real crazy. Now, this could work for me long term, but it's not likely to stay this way. So if you're concerned or confused about the raspiness, yeah, your boy's been under the weather. Please take the time, like, subscribe, bell icon for notification. We're just dropping boxing content. Now let's get into it. The resume. I did a video a month or so ago, just highlighting the resume, and how I broke that video down in particular is I just talked about the strength of the resumes. The last 5-6 guys they fought. If you're Bud Crawford, the last 5 guys, because I wanted to operate in the space of his welterweight resume where he's currently competing at, and Errol Spence Jr. There is a very popular boxing channel on YouTube. Once I start getting into what they were kind of breaking down, you'll know who it is. Shout out to them, though. It was just a conversation kind of surrounding the fact, not the fact that, but they were highlighting, is Errol Spence's resume that good? They talked about Kell Brook. You know, he got beat, stopped by Golovkin, got one of his eyeballs jammed up. After that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to be overly critical of his resume. He fought all champions. Carlos Ocampo, who's now won 5 in a row, 4 stoppages, if I'm not mistaken. He's been doing his thing. But for the sake of argument, let's say I agree with the assessment that Errol Spence's resume is not that good. I then would also have to acknowledge that Bud Crawford's is still worse. Because you think about it, 2 of the 5 individuals he's fought at welterweight are after Errol Spence fought him, the years after he fought him, right? Multiple losses, differences in circumstance, things of that nature. Then you got a Jose Benavidez and a Jeff Horn and an Amir Khan. So even if I'm going to say, yeah, you know what, Errol's not that impressive, I also have to acknowledge that Bud Crawford's is lacking, more so than an Errol Spence Jr. And that's really not a knock. And the reason why I want to do this second video about the resume, because I want to get into what it really means. We know that styles make fights at the end of the day. You can have fought all bums in tomato cans, but if your style is crazy and Errol Spence can't handle that, if you're a Bud Crawford, then it didn't matter who you fought. It didn't matter that you fought Jeff Horn. It didn't matter that you fought Jose Benavidez on one leg. None of it mattered because your style was much too much for an Errol Spence Jr. That's the reality. But for the purposes of this conversation, what does the resume really mean? And what is all attached to the resume? So we talked about the 5 fighters, but the other thing I want to talk about is this. Actually, let me go back. What the resume really determines is A-side, B-side, bargaining chips, and negotiation. That is it. That's the only legitimate application of the resume conversation that you can actually have when it comes to determining what's going to happen in a fight. Because at the end of the day, they still got to fight. And if Errol Spence goes out there and get knocked out in one round, it's not going to matter who Bud Crawford fought. If Crawford just outboxes him and does a bunch of crazy shit to Errol, it's not going to matter that he fought Jeff Horn for his only belt. It's not going to matter. But here's where it does matter. We know it's B-side Bud, A-side Errol. We do know that. Don't even dispute it. Errol has fought all champions to get his belts. He's currently unified. Most recently, he beat Yordenis Ugas. We know he beat Sean Porter when he was a champion. Then he went to Sheffield and beat Kell Brook in his backyard. When Kell Brook was undefeated at 147 pounds, he lifted the belt off Sean Porter. So that's what we know. That puts you in a position to be an A-side. Now, here's the second thing, and I don't know if a lot of you guys knew this. We know Bob Arum talked a lot of shit about his inability to make money with a Bud Crawford. It's what makes him re-signing with him, I believe, in 2018 head-scratching, because that relationship was already sullied. You weren't getting the fights you were checking for. Manny Pacquiao and you were under the same umbrella. That fight didn't happen. And it's been since released that, Arum he wanted to ensure that fight didn't happen. I digress. But I want to talk about pay-per-view numbers. Terence Bud Crawford is awful on pay-per-view. But I feel like a lot of that is the business's fault, Bob Arum's fault, ESPN's fault, his handler's fault back then. I pulled up these numbers. Bud Crawford fought Amir Khan on pay-per-view, that was thievery. That should have never been on pay-per-view, but it did 150,000 buys. That's 150,000 buys, excuse me. That's the break-even number. That means you put the event together, fighters got paid out, it was a pay-per-view event, and you didn't go negative. You didn't go into the red, but you also didn't make any money. The second one that I want to look at is more telling because it involves a common opponent. If you look at the numbers for Sean Porter, Bud Crawford, which is a pay-per-view, I bought that, 135,000 buys on the low end. So they did not even break even on that fight. It's rumored they got as high as 190K, but the truer numbers are looking like 150,000 buys and lower. People are not buying Bud Crawford pay-per-views. Like I mentioned before, a common opponent. If you switch over here to the Errol Spence, Sean Porter, they did in the neighborhood of 350,000 pay-per-view buys. So 135,000 and 350,000 buys pay-per-view. Common opponent, Sean Porter. This gets attached to the resume conversation. It lets you know who really is dictating the terms of this bout. Now, from what I could gather, it sounds like Errol Spence has made certain concessions just to ensure this fight will take place. Which reminds me of something. Less is always more. So there's been some worry and confusion about the lack of information that's circulating out there about the negotiations or the status of the fight. Last thing I saw is they were targeting October, but no dates have been set, or venues for that matter. I think that the less we hear, the more likely it is that fight is and will get done. I'm not worried about that. I know I did a video a couple weeks ago where I said I was worried, but there's too much good momentum headed towards that fight happening. Something catastrophic would have to happen, like just some dumb shit. Like, I don't even know. Just something ridiculous. But anyway, so you have your overall resume, champions you beat, belts you've lifted, and then you look at these numbers. And I think in the Amir Khan fight for Bud Crawford, I think he made less money than Amir Khan. So essentially what that states is that Amir Khan at that moment in time was a more established name in boxing than Bud Crawford, even though Bud Crawford was pound for pound, undisputed at 140 and undefeated and beating the shit out of people. But they still gave the money not to Amir Khan. And then this is what he was checking for, Terence Crawford. And which brings me to my next point. If you guys know or have any additional information, who is Bud Crawford mediating with? Who is he dealing with to get this fight over the line? Is it just Bomac and himself? Maybe a couple of... Does he have a network behind him? Does he have a professional team of facilitators to ensure this deal gets done? We know Errol Spence, Showtime PPC, Al Heyman, Steven Espinosa. Like, these guys are business professionals. They've been at this for a long time. Some of the best in the business. So we know who's going to the bargaining table. Who's going for Terence Crawford? And is that part of the issue? Perhaps, there's been rumor that it was a money situation, and perhaps they're getting caught up in that realm where an advisor would be able to say, hey, look, this is great money, the most money you've ever made. Let's go ahead and take this deal and check for a rematch clause if things don't go our way. Just something along those lines. But I definitely understand the anxiety. And I feel like we're in a good position to get this done. But this is my time. This is your boy JG. I'm going to try to get some more content out here today as I start to feel a little better. Let me know what you guys think. What are your thoughts on that resume conversation from the perspective of all it really determines is who gets what in the negotiation, not who's going to win a fight on the night, Saturday, whenever, when they get in there. And I've said this before in a previous video. If you want to evaluate fighters and actually be good at it, look at their established patterns, what they've done over and over and over again, and pit those things against each other. What Errol does well, what Bud does well, areas of weakness for Bud, areas of weakness for Errol. That's how you go about doing this. You play the resume conversation, whether you're checking for Errol or Bud. There's not enough legitimate, solid information there from a combat perspective that will tell you, oh, okay, yeah, this guy is more favored to win because his competition was stiffer. I can make the argument because he had stiffer competition that he's not as fresh, right? See, it can go different ways. But anyway, this is your boy JG. This is the Punch Report. Please like, subscribe, bell icon for notification. We out.